Okay, we're live.
Yeah. We're live now? Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this live discussion on Pakistan's content restriction conundrum. My name is Fiza Abid, and I'm the program officer at CEJ. The Center for Excellence in Journalism was designed by the, okay, so they cannot hear us. So the Center for Excellence in Journalism basically works for the professional development of journalists across Pakistan. This was designed through a grant from the US State Department to the ICFJ, which in collaboration then with Northwestern University and IBA. The center was established in 2016. We do trainings for journalists with various partners on various topics, and we also have a master's program in journalism. And so far, we have graduated 2 of our batches who are working in the field of journalism right now. Today, we're here to discuss the new social media and content restrictions. We will be discussing Facebook's recent transparency report. Along with that, we will also look at the Section 37 and its restriction and how what it constitutes and how it impacts the freedom of speech and what laws are there. For that, we have with us Fariha Aziz, who's going to be moderating the session. Fariha is a Karachi-based journalist. We also have with us Ramsha Jahangir, who is an award-winning journalist, and she covers human rights and technology. And Mr. Salahuddin Ahmed has also joined us, who is a Karachi-based barrister and an advocate of the Supreme Court. Over to you, Fariha.
Thanks, Fiza. So, Ramsha, I just want to start with you. The Facebook transparency report was recently released, and obviously restrictions from Pakistan were also recorded, which has been a frequent occurrence. But rather than we usually get into the discussion on numbers, right? Whether the reporting has increased, whether the compliance is increased. But what I want to specifically discuss is the content categories, right? So you also wrote an article covering the transparency report. So if you could first run us through what the report, basically the most current report, what does it contain? And then we'll take it from there.
So last year, in 2019, we reported around 14, up to date, we've reported over 14,000 URLs according to PTA, and Facebook has removed around over 12,000 of those links. But the interesting bit is that in the transparency report, only over 8,000 URLs were mentioned. And that means items, pages, accounts, anything that, including content on Instagram. It means that was removed under Pakistan's local law, because the transparency report doesn't mention items that Facebook has removed for its community standards. So it means that whatever was removed, mentioned in the transparency report, was removed under the local law, which is the Pakistan cybercrime law. The categories that Facebook mentions in the report, and it uses the word allegedly. It says that these items allegedly violated Pakistan's cybercrime law for anti-polio content, anti-blasphemy, child pornography, defamation. They also separately removed 5 items for defamation, which they said they require a legal order for. They've also removed content that is against the country's independence. So these are some very wide categories that they've, and specifically under Section 37 of our cybercrime law, whatever categories come under the Section 37, they remove it. But I find it interesting that they also remove that content, and that they also use the word allegedly violation of the law.
Okay, so Salahuddin, there's been a debate over the years, right, in terms of how companies, so what is the due diligence process? How do they determine whether something violates local law? And Facebook reports, ever since the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act was enacted, has now started citing, Section 37 or PTA or local law, but never specifically which law some of this may be restricted under, right? So some of my questions, so we think that Section 37, which gives PTA the powers, now it's badly legislated in the sense that they've copy pasted Article 19 and this PTA can interpret or apply those restrictions. But some of the categories that are listed in the transparency report, for instance, defamation, and others like a country's independence. Now, so we know we have a defamation law, but what about some of these other categories? Do we have laws that specifically prohibit this speech? And then is PTA authorized to even go beyond what are the listed categories under Section 37 to basically report and restrict and block access to anything in our laws, PPC, other statutes, etc.?
I think you have to basically start from what Facebook does, right? So Facebook has its own content community standards, its own content regulation, and then it also, in order to operate in different countries, it abides by some, but not all of the laws of that country in relation to the carrying of content. Now, there is, first, if you look at the Facebook aspect of it, now there is an interesting debate which was carried on in the United States, but I think it's probably even more applicable to Pakistani jurisprudence, which is whether, Facebook as a private company can completely just, take off whatever they want and keep on whatever they want. In the United States, for example, there used to be the US Supreme Court at one time said that certain kinds of private premises, like, where the public has access and there is a whole history of the public being free to come and go from those places, such as they were company-owned towns or malls, for instance. So they held that initially they held that people had a right to free speech on those privately owned premises as well. Eventually, the US Supreme Court pulled back and they said, well, no, they overturned it, except in certain states which had more robust free speech laws. And the reason why they pulled it back was because in the United States, for example, free speech is something that the state is obliged to respect, but not anyone else, right? There's a negative injunction on the state not to abridge the freedom of speech. Now, the Pakistani constitutional framework is slightly different because we have a number of judgments which say that the fundamental rights guaranteed under the Pakistan constitution are to be respected even by private actors, right? So that would mean that theoretically, because obviously there's not been litigated thus far in Pakistan, but it would mean that in certain kind of like places like Facebook, which, about 1 billion people are on Facebook, there's an expectation. It is like a public forum as such, even though it's being provided by a private party. I think it's certainly arguable that the freedom of speech enshrined in the Pakistani constitution, any actor that is in Pakistan is obliged to respect that, as far as Pakistani content is concerned. So even Facebook's community regulations, I think, would nevertheless, they couldn't ban things that would otherwise be permissible. That might be, at least from the Pakistani point of view, if Facebook had a sufficient presence here, be problematic. The second thing, the question that you asked were related to our local laws. Now, there is, of course, Section 37 of the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, and that basically just carries Article 19 of the Constitution, and it says that the PTA can, the authority can just issue directions that asking somebody to take off any content, to remove any content, if it infringes the glory of Islam, the integrity of Pakistan, etc., etc. Now, there is, as you pointed out, there's a real problem with Section 37 itself. In as much as Article 19 of the Constitution, it says that there shall be freedom of speech subject to reasonable restrictions imposed by law in the interests of the glory of Islam, integrity of Pakistan, commission of an offense, contempt, etc., etc. But the important thing to note is that the freedom of speech can only be, there are two kind of safeguards there. The freedom of speech can only be infringed. One, it has to be a reasonable restriction. And two, it has to be imposed by a law. And three, it has to be for a particular purpose allowed under the Constitution, which is the 4 or 5 categories I'd mentioned earlier. So what is wrong about Section 37 of PICA is that instead of having a law, which means that in the statute you would say that, you would categorize that these kind of speeches tend to, militate against the glory of Islam. These categories of speech tend to militate against the integrity of Pakistan. These categories of speech will be considered contemptuous. Rather than the law defining it, the entire discretion has been given to the authority itself. That, I think, is probably unconstitutional. Of course, I don't think it's been tested as far. So there is that problem with the law itself. Apart from PICA, there are a number of other laws which, they ban or prohibit certain kinds of speech. There is, for example, under the Anti-Terrorism Act, there's certain kinds of speech, which support inciting terrorism, etc. These kind of things are prohibited under that act. The Protection of Pakistan Act has similar provisions. Then the PPC has certain provisions. There is, of course, Section 499 and 500, which deal with criminal defamation. But there's other kind of speech. There's sedition, etc. Working against the ideology of Pakistan is very loosely defined, but it's in the Pakistan Penal Code itself. So there are a number of other laws which, although they don't fall within, PICA, but they do prohibit speech. And they prohibit speech no matter what, platform it's on, whether it's, in print, in news, or on TV, or, over the internet. So those laws do exist.
Sorry, can you hear me? So I just want to follow up on that. So the laws exist. Now, I just want to, let's take, for example, Section 20, which also exists in the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, right? And that's what we are terming as the criminal defamation section. Now, for the procedure laid out under the law is that you will make a complaint to the FIA. The FIA, as per the rules, and the procedure under the law, is going to investigate, and then the court is going to either take cognizance, there will be a trial, etc., determination whether the content is defamatory, not defamatory, right? Now, say for instance, this procedure, somebody is charged under the law, right? And it turns out that the court says, well, this was not defamation. However, the PTA, somebody parallel to that reports it to the PTA, and so you take that content down. So while the court reaches a conclusion that this was not defamatory, the PTA has already reported it, and the company has already accepted that complaint as face value, that PTA has determined it's defamatory. So in a sense, would that not be prior restraint? And also, is the PTA then authorized? Can PTA report content under other statutes which require, let's say, a criminal procedure or a complaint to be made to the police or the FIA or any other authority, and subjects it to a judicial process, can the PTA just circumvent that and start reporting content in these categories?
Well, I think, there's no absolute bar on, prior restraint. There are some cases where prior restraint is essential. Also, there has to be a distinction between the criminal process and the civil process. Now, under Section 20, obviously, you've committed a crime. The FIA is a crime investigation agency. You'll be sent up for a trial, and the criminal court will come to one decision or another. I mean, that's the same for provisions, all kinds of, whether it's provisions relating to terrorism laws or pornography laws or whatever. So there is that whole criminal process. It cannot be that you just can't touch that content, until the conclusion of the criminal trial. But what I think is the proper interpretation of the law is what the Islamabad High Court, did, which is that when the PTA takes any action against any material that the PTA considers, or either it's reported to PTA that this material infringes law A, B, C, or the PTA takes action on its own, it must give notice to the affected parties. And in this case, I would think that it is obviously the person who's posted the content or the person whose website it is or whatever it is, and also the host social media company. They're both affected parties. Those notices must issue, and those are necessary for two reasons. One, because our Supreme Court has on almost hundreds of occasions held that the rules of natural justice must be read into every statute, which basically mean that if you propose to take any adverse action against any person, you have to give them notice and hearing and allow them to justify why the action should not be taken against them. And then when you do decide, if you do decide after the hearing to take the action against them, then you have to give reasons for it and communicate those reasons to the affected party. Now, in this case, so if you had objectionable content, the authority should give notice to the company as well as the affected person. You might have, it doesn't necessarily need to be a long drawn-out hearing. That depends on the circumstances of the case. It might be that it's such an emergent matter that, notice of 24 hours is sufficient, and it doesn't have to be, in person. It can be online. It can be, through email or whatever. You can have written hearings. But that process must be followed. Without that, I don't believe that the authorities' directions under Section 37 to Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, whatever, I don't think those directions are legal if they're done without a hearing.
Okay. So this is an important point, Ramsha. What we know of how blocking is done in Pakistan, right? And also specifically under Section 37, AWP went to the Islamabad High Court saying that, we were never given notice, no reasons, and that was recorded in their judgment. And so the judgment that Salahuddin is also citing, interestingly, the order says, and the PTA official actually went to court and said, but we don't have to give notice, right? And so that view was corrected by Justice Asad Minallah saying, well, no, natural justice and 10A and other rights have to be read into it. And anyway, subsection 4 of this Section 37 also says that an aggrieved party may challenge an order passed, right? But if you're never going to pass an order, then how are they going to challenge it? So in practice, what is it that you've seen covering the sector over the years, covering blocking. AWPs is one of the rare examples. Before that, Khabristan Times. Now, not everybody has the ability or does go to court, right, for various reasons. And so this is one, and how aware are companies that this process should be in place? We know this about companies, that they have user notification. For instance, Twitter does it, right? Or Facebook, you'll get an alert if your content was either reported, removed, etc. But locally, PTA, what is the process, or isn't, what doesn't exist?
It's not always possible to get answers. Even in the case of Awami Workers Party's website, it wasn't reported anywhere till it came in the media, and then they took the case, pursued it, and then we got the order that we did. And now we've set a precedent that PTA is supposed to inform the Great Party. But then at the same time, for instance, we have a very recent example. Twitter was down in Pakistan on Sunday. And I think today is the third day that we haven't received a proper official response from PTA. Not that there haven't been queries, but we have been asking. There is a certain group that says the timing of the takedown was very suspicious because it coincided with a virtual conference. So there have been a lot of speculations. There is a lot of evidence that has come forth. Netblocks did a very good report on that confirms the disruption. Twitter has said that the outage was not from their end, but then at the same time, there's no official confirmation or even a denial from the government. So yeah, a lot of times they do. And then at the same time, we've also seen a lot of websites being taken down unless someone figures out, someone checks, okay, this website is down, and then they take it to PTA or report on it. Otherwise, we are not informed. There is no transparency. There is no place to go where we can find out. And this is why I'm coming back to the transparency report. The transparency reports only show what content was taken down under local law, but we don't know. We know the categories which we discussed are very vague under the law, but we don't know what exactly was taken down. Was anyone informed or not? And then now we're moving towards online harms rules, which talks about regulation, which specifies certain characters, certain categories. So when the online harms were introduced, they said that our major priority areas are blasphemy, child pornography, extremism, hate speech. And the two new categories that they talked about was character assassination and fake news. Now, fake news is not included in under any law, I believe, as of now. So it's not legally punishable. But then also character assassination, do you confuse it with defamation, or do you deal it very differently? Now, that's another question to ask, because in Senate committee meetings, in our political meetings, a lot of senators and government officials have raised this point that there is a lot of character assassination against them online, that there is a lot of defamation against them online, and they ask PTA to take action. A very recent example is a coordinated trend against Shiri Mazari on Twitter. I think it was Sack Shiri Mazari or something like that. So obviously, in situations like these, what do you do? Do you ask the platform to take down or act against these accounts? And what do you identify that as? Is that character assassination? Is that defamation? And also under the law, who makes that complaint? Does PTA have the authority to make complaint on behalf of a person, an aggrieved person or party, or is Shiri Mazari in this case supposed to make that complaint to companies? So these are some questions to think about. And thirdly, I think the biggest problem with our regulation is that there are a lot of stakeholders with the power to make complaints. We talk about PTA because that's the official authority under the law, but then at the same time, there are 30 different stakeholders who have access to our e-portal and can make complaints or flag content to be removed. And these 30 stakeholders can be intelligence agencies, they can be security, they can be police officials as well, some FC people in Balochistan. I mean, it's very diverse. And also the Ministry of Religious Affairs, for instance, alone has made so many complaints to Facebook to remove content that they deem as anti-Islam or against the glory of Islam. I mean, I think around 24,000 URLs alone were reported by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. So I think this involvement of so many stakeholders is also problematic, because the more voices you have, and this is very subjective, and there's also more pressure on PTA And which is why they've used this excuse per se to come up with online harms, because they say there's a lot of pressure from government and there's a lot of pressure from different stakeholders, and they aren't happy with how platforms are dealing with their content. They feel that while, and if you look at the, so PTA has put up a questionnaire online, which is open to public to take, and it's very basic. It's a questionnaire which is based on leading questions. So either you say yes or you say no. And the questions are very something like you cannot say no to. For instance, should platforms remove something that is against the glory of Islam? Or should they abide, if they don't abide by local law, should they be held accountable? So this is what we're moving towards, more and more control, and already with the involvement of so many stakeholders, it's a lot of confusion as well, and that is why regulation is so widespread. But then at the same time, it's problematic because, and then also on platforms, the responsibility, like I said, the Ministry of Religious Affairs has reported these items to Facebook. So, I mean, overall, we've contributed, and according to the latest transparency report, where after Russia, we're the country which sent the most requests to Facebook. So because so many stakeholders are sending requests and are flagging problematic content, it also puts more pressure on platforms, whether they comply to it, who do they entertain, who do they not? And I think these are the questions that need to be asked as well, and this involvement needs to be more streamlined.
So this again brings me back to, and we'll move on to the rules. But now you're saying that Ministry of Religious Affairs and a bunch of other, whether it's agencies or police or other ministries, they report. So prior to PICA, the reporting sort of procedures and everything was ambiguous. Just like how the Twitter suspension, there is no official corroboration what happened. Twitter has said it was not from our end. So presumably it was done here, except that there's no official comment, right? So prior to PICA, the narrative went something like this. So there existed an interministerial committee, which was set up by the Prime Minister in 2006. It was notified, and we were told that this committee would evaluate websites and it would make decisions, and then the ISPs would be instructed through PTA. However, there was no record of meetings of this committee, no decisions, etc. Nothing was ever reported. When websites were discovered to be blocked, right? Or you couldn't access them. There used to be this whole process where people would try in different cities, different ISPs, and then try through a VPN or a proxy. And when they were able to access it through a VPN or proxy, then they determined that, okay, this must be blocked. Then came the surf safely sign, right? So sometimes they admitted it, sometimes there was no official admittance. When Section 37 and other sections of PICA were being debated and challenged, and Section 37 was opposed, the industry view was that, okay, if you designate one authority, at least there will be some accountability, right? So it's not randomly anybody getting up and reporting things. If something is blocked, you know who to ask, right? And so that authority is going to give you answers. 4 years almost after this law has been enacted, we're still in the situation where we don't necessarily always get answers, right? The other Islamabad High Court judgment, when Bolobi had petitioned in 2014, challenging the legality and constitutionality of the IMCW, saying that, this is an executive committee, through an executive notification, this was set up, no statutory backing, and then they send all these requests. So PTA or the federal government does not have the legal authority to make these decisions. Meanwhile, PICA was brought in, etc., all of that. In 2018, the final judgment was issued. In that order, because Section 37 was already there, the Islamabad High Court said that PTA and only PTA is to decide independently without any external influence. So the federal government may lay recommendations, as can anybody else. However, those are not binding. And so this function under 37 is only to be exercised by PTA, which brings me to then the rules. So online harms rules, the way that they were, suddenly we discovered after federal cabinet approval that these rules have now been notified under Section 37, right? Right now they are saying, and Salahuddin, I'd like you to answer this right now, where after a lot of public outrage from companies, from local civil society actors, media, they said, okay, we're going to put them on hold. where we've suspended, and that's the term that they've used, we've suspended the rules, even though cabinet and that the prime minister has constituted a committee for consultation. So we don't know what the legal status is. The other thing is that, the rules go on. One of the things that was being raised is they go even beyond the ambit of Section 37. They create the Office of a National Coordinator. The ministry is going to notify. So it's going back to the federal government versus a statutory authority that has been given mandate under the law, questionable as it is, whether the mandate or the independence. But now it's going back within the domain of the executive and looser checks. So one, the status of the rules. What is the suspended business when the federal cabinet has given approval? And can the prime minister unilaterally then decide to withdraw or do some of these things that they're saying?
Before I get onto the online harm rules, Freya, I'd just like to touch upon some of the points that you and Ramsha had raised, especially about the PTA and then all these unofficial actors, these 30 different stakeholders that Ramsha referred to. Now, as we've seen, there are sometimes there are occasions where PTA takes action and it's open. Everyone knows that PTA has taken the action. It may be that PTA has not followed the proper process. It's not issued notice. It's not conducted a hearing, etc. But at least it's an official state act. Then there are, of course, these unofficial, presumably state acts, which Ramsha mentioned, the Twitter outage, a few days ago. I think it's quite important that, and possibly it's only the judiciary that can really get round to it, that, because if all this information is certainly available with the PTA, if all the servers simultaneously go down in Pakistan, it certainly has that information available. And if you had a proactive, judiciary that was, keen on protecting, fundamental rights of speech, definitely this kind of irregular, non-state action could be stopped. And, this is somewhere where it could be done relatively easy. There are other non-state acts, which are tougher to pin down, but these are relatively easy to pin down. And there is a tremendous responsibility, I think, on the judiciary in Pakistan to ensure that, the proper process is followed and only the official state actor, the PTA, actually takes those actions, after due process. The other thing that I think is important is that companies like Facebook and Twitter, etc., they have an ethical responsibility to ensure that, the requests that they receive from PTA, that they are reasonable and in keeping with not just, the letter and spirit of Pakistani law, but also international covenants, right? And at least they state, and in many cases they do, there's certain countries that have, horribly restrictive laws. And, Facebook and Twitter, etc., they refuse to enforce those laws on their platforms. Now, in the Pakistani context, I think it's fairly easy for them to say, well, yes, if you want us to take down some content, then please show us that you conducted a hearing, you heard the party, and give us the reasons why you want to take it down. And they should, at least in cases where this, they should have more robust legal advice on what, it's not just, the PTA comes up with a rule or just a letter saying that, well, this is against Pakistani law, so we're taking it off air. They need to have better guidelines for their reviewers, explaining what actually the legal requirement in Pakistan is in light of certain judicial decisions as well. You pointed out Justice Athar Minalla's verdict. Exactly. So, they have to ensure that that process is followed, even if it is not explicitly set out in the rule itself. It is certainly part of Pakistani law, right? Judge-made law. So with that, if coming to your question about the rules, the online harm rules, first of all, there's no such, I've never heard in my career as a lawyer, at least, it's been 20 years, of rules being suspended by the government. And apparently the cabinet passed those rules. And once the cabinet passes the rules, the government is the cabinet. And neither the prime minister nor the secretary of the department, nobody has the power to restrain the promulgation of the rules. The cabinet has decided. Unless the cabinet itself reconvenes and they take those rules back, those rules are, at least in the legal sense, they are part of the landscape of Pakistani law.
So Ramsha, because you've been going back and forth a lot, right, on the rules and so again, where there was now PTA has uploaded the survey, and like you mentioned, also there's certain leading questions, the yes and no categories. You can there's a text box where you can qualify your answer, but I mean, you still have to first answer yes and no, and they're calling it suspended. And this is something they've been saying it was a result of the outrage, right? And the outrage or the critique of the rules is that it goes far beyond actually the ambit of Section 37. Also, there are data localization clauses in there, which companies are also resistant to. And there was the AIC statement. And then obviously, they have these definitions like extremism, right? And so those can be very vague, especially given our track record for cracking down on dissent, labeling people as anti-state, whether it's shutting down their speech or then, prosecuting them or persecuting them in whatever way. So what has your conversation, or has there been any conversation on this particular legality and the status of the rules, and what is now in store that the survey form is up, right? What is the expectation? What are we consulting over when they they've been approved and they could very well go into effect? So what is this input going to do?
As far as their on-record statements go, they've specifically said that the implementation of rules has been suspended. So by suspended, they mean the implementation of the rules in its current form has been suspended. So the one thing we're clear on, that the rules in the existing form will not be implemented. However, now the first step they formed a committee, the Prime Minister, on the Prime Minister's directions, they made a committee which is supposed to meet and discuss the timeline and everything. So the questionnaire, for instance, is the first step they've put out in their consultation process. And they say that the questionnaire will be available for public feedback for a month. And then after that, I expect a series of meetings directly with the stakeholders involved, which is the companies and the local stakeholders, to discuss the responses they've received on the questionnaire, and maybe certain sort of focus groups with the stakeholders. But the problem remains, firstly, of course, the legality aspect of it, that even if we can consult on the existing rules, even if this phrasing implementation of rules has given a lot of room to, outrage. The fact that there hasn't been any clarity from the cabinet itself is problematic. I think when the approval news came out, there was a lot of clarity, and all the government officials, cabinet members themselves were tweeting out in support of the rules. But once the Prime Minister took notice of it, there hasn't been any as such statement from them that they say that they will want to withdraw the rules or they take them back. Only PTA has said that the implementation has been suspended. So there's that. One thing I would like to point out on what we were discussing earlier is about understanding how, for instance, Facebook operates. So I think from Facebook, they also remove content independently for violation of their community standards, which is not just for local law. If they make it public that the number of items that they've removed for under community standards for country-specific data, it will make us understand how Facebook as a company also moderates content, and also differentiate how they decide upon content, because some of the content, for instance, child pornography or harassment overlaps with their community standards. This is part of our law, and it also overlaps with their community standards. So it would be interesting to see that how they decide on categories which have an overlap. And also, so I think there is more transparency required from companies as well on how they implement and enforce their own policies. Recently, they've come up with the overboard, and Nigar Dad, one of our prominent digital rights activist, is also on the board. But again, the point is, till there is no transparency on your part, until the local law is around. I'll give you an example. So Facebook recently evolved its community standards around COVID enforcement. They said that certain COVID content that is against the guideline of WHO or government recommendations will be taken down. Now that's very problematic. When I asked PTA said that they've also removed at least 40 items under COVID enforcement policy only. But we don't know what those items are. We don't know what exactly was that content reported for, because COVID enforcement can also be very widespread. So we need those answers again. And even from Facebook's part, we don't know why and what violation was that content removed, even if it was under a local law. Then there is also the because there are different recommendations coming from provincial governments and from federal governments. So Facebook says that they're removing recommendations for federal and provincial and taking all of that into account. But again, we can't be too sure. And there are a lot of posts that are going unchecked on Facebook, a lot of irresponsible posts against COVID enforcement as well, which are still up there. So I think there are some questions that need to be answered, and there is definitely the need for more transparency on the community standards enforcement from Facebook's front. I will switch a bit to Twitter, because I think throughout this consultation process and for online, the real motivation, the bigger motivation behind online harms from the government's end has been that Twitter does not comply. Twitter does not entertain our request, and we've seen that in transparency reports. But that is also an overall global criticism of Twitter's policies, because they're not as willing to work with governments as is Facebook. So their point of view is that the Kashmir thing happened. A lot of our accounts were suspended. A lot of pro-Kashmir accounts were suspended. Twitter is not there to listen to our grievances, our concerns, and a lot of problematic content or unlawful content is going unchecked on Twitter. So what they're trying, and when the AIC backlash came and the AIC rejected, and they said that they threatened to even withdraw their services in Pakistan if we go ahead with the implementation of these rules, there was this certain, again, this whole thing that, we have to put some sort of pressure on companies, specifically Twitter, to get them to answer. And as we move on in the consultation process, and if you look at the questionnaire and the phrasing of the questions in the questionnaire, you will see there's a lot of emphasis on local law, on local context, on our political preferences, political narratives. So if anything is very anti-Pakistan or is something anti-religion, again, or against country's independence, there is a lot of nationalist preference in the questionnaire itself. It at least it alludes to that. So this is, I think, where we're moving towards, which is why I think the involvement of so many stakeholders and so many voices is also something we should discuss as we go on and consult, because we clearly see what the government's preferences are. And that's what they're trying to make companies understand. Facebook, to a point, I still feel has complied. Like I said, out of 14,000, they did remove 12,000 items. So if they involve more and more companies to do that, I think that would be definitely problematic.
So this is something that has come up consistently over the years, right? And I've heard this in courts, whether it was during the time of the YouTube ban or in parliamentary committees, where Facebook is cited as an example of a company that complies, and therefore it's, that's a good example cited by the government, whereas Twitter is a company who does not comply, and so it is problematic. And so for companies like Twitter, to get them to comply, we need stringent laws and rules, and basically get them to localize, right? Now, this localization debate is, as old as YouTube. And because YouTube was not restricting a certain piece of content, they kept it banned for nearly 3 years. Then they said, okay, we're going to give them intermediary liability protection, and there were assurances given to court and to Parliament that then they're going to come and localize. No company was giving that assurance. These things were just part of the local discourse. Intermediary liability protection in a very limited manner was extended through the cybercrime law. Still, no company has come. So obviously there are market interests that also drive these decisions, right? It's not simply just intermediary liability protection. But as far as transparency reports go, also there was a demand at RightsCon in 2005 to companies that we get numbers. We need more quantitative data in terms of what is the decision-making process. Aladdin, alluded to some of, so the due diligence, what should that due diligence process entail? Now, as we move forward, as you're saying, COVID is also an issue, right? And we know that provinces have been at odds with each other. The Supreme Court is off on another tangent, right? Whose version of what is acceptable nationally is going to be implemented? So PTA functions under the federal government is going to probably, report whatever falls foul or whatever they've come up with. But that can be in complete, contradict what a provincial government may be saying, or where we've actually been, complaining about what, let's say, some people are saying what the federal government is doing is not correct, or what the Supreme Court is doing is not correct, or even the Sindh government, or let's say data, right? If we say the numbers are being suppressed or exaggerated, there will always be different points of view. So how do you then, even globally, like the US, for instance, there are people who are saying this is against our rights. There's the whole, we're not going to wear masks, you can't force us to wear masks, etc. So can, Salahuddin, if you can comment on this dilemma also, that there will the whole marketplace of ideas and where rights are more protected versus over here where we want a more nationalistic, and whose definition of a nationalistic perspective definition is going to be applied. And secondly, on the rules process, right, through which they want to achieve all of these things, get companies here, make sure they abide by local laws. India is cited as an example, but many of these companies have a physical and legal presence in India, and where they do in other jurisdictions, laws obviously become binding, whereas with Pakistan, that's not the case. Burhan Wani and Kashmir has been a huge issue. Where if you were to just write Burhan Wani's name, posts started disappearing, and a lot of people here also complained of that. I'll give you an example of something that happened to a friend, which was, made a comment naming Khadim Rizvi, and then her comment got reported, right? And so if they have categorized these individuals as dangerous individuals, what happens also from a journalism point of view, or just a society's point of view, when you're having debates, you have opinions out there, incitement is different, right? Even glorification gets murky. So companies and governments deciding based on what? And then the rules, if there's consultation happening, and people say, okay, you need to take certain things out or put certain things in, amend them significantly. How would that process go forward with cabinet approval as it stands on the rule? So what would have to be done to actually change the letter of the rules right now?
Well, I mean, the first thing you mentioned about how the companies sometimes take arbitrary actions and remove content that is not actually barred by any law, and it's, it doesn't sound like it should be barred under any community standards as well. I think that's an area where, what I was saying earlier about the freedom of speech guarantee in Pakistan applying to private companies as well, that might be relevant there. But one of the problems in really, this might be settled, like you might, for example, argue that, Facebook's community standards in a particular area are too restrictive, or, just taking off somebody's post because they mentioned Khadim Rizvi, that sounds like a completely unreasonable, restriction on the freedom of speech. So, but to effectively enforce that against Facebook or Twitter or whatever, obviously they need to have a sufficient presence in Pakistan so as to, allow our enforcement mechanism to engage with them. And that's been a problem with courts, as you mentioned. It's been a problem with governments as well. Presently, as far as these particular online harm rules are concerned, I think, first of all, they are enforced. There's no two opinions about that because, they've been passed by cabinet. Now, you can't have, it's like, the parliament passing a police act or the government framing police rules and the IG coming in saying, well, we're not going to enforce them for the time being. You can't do it. The PTA can't suspend them. The prime minister, he's not superior to the cabinet. He's part of the cabinet, so it just can't happen. Anyway, but moving on to the rules themselves. Now, the rules have a number of these overarching, vast, kind of powers that they want, but they're completely beyond the scope of the enabling legislation, which is the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. And the hierarchy, as you know, is very clear. There's the Constitution, then there are statutes that have to be within the four corners of this Constitution. And then there are rules which have to be within the framework and four corners of the statute itself. Now, the statute itself doesn't say anything. The rules they establish this body of the national coordinator. The act itself says, doesn't mention any such post. It doesn't give any such powers to any such individual, etc. So that, the government can't now just make up rules. They'll have to go back. If they want a national coordinator, they'll have to go back to Parliament and get the Parliament to amend PICA to allow for a national coordinator. Similarly, they have these obligations on part of social media companies that they have to establish an office in Pakistan, etc., etc., etc. Again, the statute doesn't require any such thing. I don't think the government can enforce this by way of rules. Then they've got this provision about that all social media companies, they'll give any investigation agency any information or content that the investigation agency may require. Again, the Act itself, I think that there's Section 39 of the Act of PICA that very precisely enumerates the conditions on which any investigation agency can ask information from a social media company or a service provider. And it is, when they have a reasonable suspicion of a crime being committed, about to be committed, etc. The PTA Act even has a similar provision about that. Or if there's a genuine national security threat, only in those circumstances are they allowed to solicit that information. But the rules, they go ahead and they say, well, any investigation agency, anytime it wants, they can get whatever they like from any company. It's against the statute, it's against the Constitution. So, then they've also introduced this provision that if social media companies don't listen to us, then we can penalize them up to 500 billion rupees. Again, they've just made that power up out of the blue. It doesn't exist in the statute. They can't do it. So the rules as they stand, I think, are clearly, illegal. And I think they would be struck down in minutes if it came to court. And that is possibly why the government is so keen now to get more of a, have 10,000 people saying, well, we support these kind of rules. And if you have leading questions, do you believe in the glory of Islam? Do you think that character assassination is a bad thing? So if you have those kind of leading questions, it's like Zaul Haq's referendum,
Yes.
And so then they come and say, well, everybody in Pakistan wants these rules. So that's why we've decided now to go ahead with the implementation.
Well, that's precisely what it seems to be. And also, like you mentioned, so for data, there are warrants that are required under various sections of PICA. So,
and the court has to authorize it. It can't be just the agency. The court has to say yes. Exactly.
Absolutely. So you can't just circumvent
that through the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. Fiza, I think we have questions. And then we can take concluding comments from everyone. Let's see what questions we have.
Yeah, so we'll take some questions at this point. Somebody asked right in the beginning when we were talking about freedom of speech, and they wanted to know that who decides what constitutes as freedom of speech. Would it be, how do you monitor that? And does the content creator decide it, or does the government have a say in it?
Salahuddin, you want to take that?
Well, there are certain types of speech which can be prohibited by the government, provided there is a law to prohibit that. Whether you fall, let's say, there's a law saying that you cannot glorify terrorists or terrorism, right? Now, whether your speech does actually glorify, terrorism. Now, the first stop would possibly be in, when you're online, it would be the PTA. So the PTA issues you a notice saying you said such and such thing in favor of such and such person on such and such date. We think that this amounts to glorifying terrorism, and this kind of speech does not enjoy the free speech guarantee. So we are going to be taking it down unless you can justify that this wasn't, glorifying terrorism. So the PTA does that exercise. It passes an order. It says, yes, well, this is protected free speech or it's not. And then if you don't like the PTA's order, you can ask them to review it. Then you can go to a high court and appeal. Eventually, of course, in all these matters, it is the courts that adjudicate whether something falls within, the ambit of free speech, or it is within the categories that can be prohibited. So ultimately, it's a judicial exercise.
Okay. So the next question is the judiciary up to it to rein in our powerful stakeholders and unofficial state actors?
You again.
Well,
that fluctuates. Sometimes they have been more robust about reining in non-state or unofficial state actors. Sometimes they've been less robust. That is a continuing struggle, I think.
Okay. If proves that the government or any of its agency was behind the Sunday's Twitter outrage, then can Twitter sue the government of Pakistan on any international forum for violating the Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights?
Sorry, that's for me as well?
I guess.
The government sued Twitter if Twitter was responsible for the outage?
No, vice opposite. So can Twitter do something about the government?
I don't think that Twitter would have the standing to sue the government of Pakistan. I don't think particular, at least in our courts, I don't think they would have standing.
I mean, because then they would have to assume jurisdiction of the courts, which is something companies are reluctant to do, to file a challenge here. But internationally, I mean, where I know of other countries and jurisdictions where Twitter, for instance, in Turkey had filed against the government for restricting. So where they have a local physical presence and they're subjected to local laws, they do tend to challenge. But at an international forum, I mean, the contravention of, say, Declaration of Human Rights or the ICCPR, which were also, but I haven't seen that happen as such, like International Court of Justice sort of thing.
I mean, Twitter doesn't actually possess any legal right to operate in Pakistan. I mean, well, it would be different if Twitter came to Pakistan and they got a license and they set up their server and their office in Pakistan, and then the government suddenly stopped their operations, then Twitter would have a standing. But as it is, any foreign company can't just suddenly come to Pakistan and say, well, you should allow my product to be disseminated in Pakistan. There is a better argument for a citizen of Pakistan to say that there is this source of information and this forum for speech that is available globally, and my right to access that is being limited, and as such my right of information and my right to information and my right to free speech guaranteed by the Constitution as a citizen of Pakistan is being infringed when you take away these internet options from me. So that might be a better challenge. I don't think Twitter itself would have a right to sue.
But so this is towards Ramsha. Where do you stand as a journalist or even as an individual when your freedom of speech or opinion, in fact, is so restricted now, because without any judicial process, your content can be taken down under any category, and of course you wouldn't even know the reason behind it. So where do you stand then as a journalist, and what do you do then?
I don't think there is, I don't think they can remove anything without you not having the ability to ask. For instance, we've seen in Awami Workers Party's website's case that they've set a precedent that you will be informed before PTA, for instance, removes a website or anything. As far as reporting your content to companies is concerned, like reporting tweets, and we have seen this in the past, that a lot of tweets from journalists have been reported to Twitter and have been restricted locally. We have, of course, questioned that, and this is where it's going. And why I mentioned character assassination and fake news as the key priority areas is because that affects journalists the most. We have seen a lot of coordinated trends against journalists in the past year. We have seen character assassination of specific journalists where their names were abused and they literally were apparent on the Twitter top trend. But there was no action taken. Abuse has become a norm on Twitter these days, but there is no action taken. Fake news journalists are being criticized for spreading fake news. This has become the new unofficial crackdown of sorts to discredit credible journalists and media organizations. Whereas fake news I see is a whole holistic problem, and I think it merits a separate discussion. But that's one of the problems we're seeing, and one of the motivations behind online harms is to control these kind of things and to control what journalists say. And even critical speech, for instance, it's become very hard as spaces are shrinking, and because there is an immediate reaction from the government or even trolls and supporters of certain parties if you say something critical. So I think that if the space is shrinking, and it's just unfortunate that character assassination has become such a norm. And if it would have been cracked down before, when it was being normalized, I think the situation could be controlled. But now it's out of hands, and now everybody's in it, journalists, government officials. So now they're both actually in it, and now we're trying to find a solution to the problem, whereas it is something that we should have approached before.
Farid, you want to wrap this up? That's all with the question.
Okay, so I guess any comments that both of you want to add, specifically recommendations to platforms also in terms of how they moderate content, and also the government going forward on rules, or as citizens, what is it? I mean, courts are an option, yes, but I know that over the last few years, there's also been a lot of conversation within civil society circles where, should we approach the court or not? Because how rights friendly is the overall bent, whether inside courts or outside, and so, not to get, say, adverse orders. So, so Laudeen, then Ramsha, and then we'll just wrap it up. Any comments, recommendations, etc.?
As far as platforms are concerned, I just repeat what I've been hammering. There's already the framework exists, the judicial decisions are there. If you're taking down content, make sure the PTA has followed due process. It's given a notice to the affected party. It's given the affected party an opportunity to reply, and it's passed a reasoned order. I don't think that that's a very difficult or time-consuming or costly kind of procedure for these platforms to follow. They just need to, whenever the reviewers just need to have a checkbox and to see whether PTA is following what is actually the proper law in Pakistan. Apart from that, I think, you raise a valid point about, the judiciary itself, there being problems with approaching it. But I think in situations, in parliamentary forms of government like Pakistan, when the government in power and the parliament are, pretty much always on the same page. You don't have a situation like, the United States maybe that, Congress is somewhere else and, the president is somewhere else. Over here, the parliament can sometimes become an ineffective means of access, because where else do you go? You either go to the parliament, or you go to, if you're unhappy with a government's approach about something, you either lobby and you go to the parliament, etc., or you go to the, judiciary. And in many cases, you'll have to end up over there and, hope for the best. Of course, that's quite apart from the, more holistic, you raise awareness about these issues, you mobilize people. But ultimately, in order to affect any kind of formal change, you'll have to end up before these two forums.
Ramsha?
I think we have three immediate stakeholders involved here. Of course, first is the platforms. And like I said, they need to be more transparent about their enforcement of community standards. So it's helpful for us to better understand how they enforce their policies as well, and not just how they apply local law. And like Salahuddin mentioned, that they should ensure that they do follow the complete processes that are there in the local law. A second is the users as well. What I've seen is that a lot of platforms are also reliant on user reports. But when we see, we don't have specific figures for that, but that's what platforms have often raised, that users in Pakistan don't report problematic content. And then eventually when users themselves don't report problematic content, it goes to the government. So rather than giving them that opportunity to take control, if, for instance, there is something about harassment, or if there is anything that you feel personally uncomfortable with, you have the option to report. If you feel that you are being, if there is a smear campaign against you on Twitter, you can report it directly to the company. And so that is how users can also take better control if they're in a grieved party. So I think this is one area that we can improve on. And the third is, of course, the government and PTA. I think the online harms rules is not just about PTA. It's also about the government. It's the cabinet that approved it. And I think more besides PTA, we also need to ask questions from the government and the cabinet members who approved it in the first place. Like I said, they distance themselves conveniently. Now there is a committee that they have formed, but out of them, I think only Shiri Mazari is a cabinet member. The rest of them are such special assistant to the Prime Minister. Then there is a PTA chairman. So there's, I think, only one cabinet member, or I believe two. I think it's one. Anyway, so the thing is, the cabinet members need to take a step up and look at the concerns. And this shouldn't be a PTA versus stakeholders sort of a consultation process. And I think they need to better be informed and take up responsibility about where this is going. They don't want to repeat the same mistake that those past speaker did.
So we got another question. Can there be a concept of uncontrolled liberty when it comes to commenting or speaking about anything on social or digital media?
So, I mean, both of you can respond if you want, but we get this question a lot about also, when you challenge regulation or laws, anything you're confronted with, but do you want there to be nothing at all, right? And I think that after this law, 4 years on, and the way that this law has been implemented, I don't think anybody should be making an argument saying, but do you want nothing at all, right? And anyway, our constitution, the way Article 19 is set out, it doesn't give us, unfortunately, I would say, sort of unfettered liberty either, because there are reasonable restrictions and it is subjected to law. And we've never really, it's never been in free for all as it's categorized. So, but I do think that we need far more than we have in the law and generally in society, right? And so where people say, but what about fake news and what about all of this? You have several provisions of PICA that apply. that can be used and have been used against people, not citizens who are harassed or harmed, but others. Yeah, for sure. Salahuddin, if you want to answer, then I think we'll wrap it up.
I mean, it's all about balance. I mean, I don't think unregulated free speech exists anywhere in the world, and I don't think it should actually. But obviously, I mean, if you want like a society that actually, if you want to live in a free society, you have to have, you know, so there are some kinds of speech that are prohibited. Our constitution permits that, but you can't just stuff everything. I mean, you know, into those categories. Like, you know, when people talk about, you know, let's say integrity of Pakistan is one of the things. I mean, you know, many people could argue that, well, you know, talking about the 18th Amendment, you know, that is an argument against the integrity of Pakistan because it, you know, envisages greater autonomy on its constituent parts. And, you know, that's against integrity of Pakistan. That should be banned. So, I mean, the restraint has to be as minimal as possible to achieve your object. And I mean, that's what the law is about.
Is there anything else?
No, that's it. I think we'll end
Okay.
here. Thank you so much, Fariha, Salahuddin. I think we've lost
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you so much for this informative discussion. And hope everybody enjoyed it and actually got something out of it. Was a learning experience for them.
Thanks, Fiza. Thanks, Salahuddin. Okay. Bye.